11.2c homework. Solve the quadratic equation. So there are a couple of ways of solving these equations. Okay, one way is we could just take the square root of both of these sides. So we could say square root of this side, square root of this side. How do we undo a square? We take the square root. Except in this case, this notation is slightly off, and this is the positive square root, but you will want to include the negative one as well. Square root of 196, and the square root of that is 14. So plus or minus 14, the square root of 196. That's one way of doing it. Solve the quadratic equation. Now in this instance right here, we probably want to use the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula looks something like this. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. But before we do that, we have to identify the a's and the b's and the c's. Now, before we can identify that, we have to set this equal to 0, which means we need to get rid of this 25x on the right side, that positive 25x. So we do that by subtracting 25x. But whatever we do to one side, we do to the other. Those cancel out, leaving me 4x squared minus 25x equals 0. Now, this coefficient right here over the x squared, that is our a. So we're going to say a is equal to 4. And it's just the coefficient, not including the x squared. B is going to be the coefficient in front of the x, the first power. And that in this case is going to be a negative 25. C is the constant that would be right here, but you don't see it, so it's just a 0. You'd actually, yeah, we'll put a 0 in there. Okay, so we have our A, B's, and C's. Okay, so now let's plug everything in. So we say negative B, B being negative 25, so it's negative 25 plus or minus the square root of negative 25 squared minus 4ac. A is 4, C is 0. That makes that a lot easier. And then we put that over 2 times A being 4. Now we simplify a little bit. So negative 25 is going to be a positive 25 plus or minus. And right here it's going to be negative 25 squared minus negative 4 times 0. All that's going to go to 0. All that right there, all that goes to 0. Just goes away. And that leaves me negative 25 squared, which is 625. And 4 times 2, or 2 times 4 is 8. So what we end up with is 25 plus or minus square root of 625, which is 25 all over 8. Now we have to do two different versions of this, right? So we have the negative version, which would be 25 minus 25 over 8, which would give me 0 over 8, which would give me 0. That's the positive version, or that's the negative version. Now we have to do the positive version, which is 25 plus 25 all over 8, which would be 50 all over 8. And depends on how they want you to answer that. It could be a decimal. It could be you could leave as a fraction. Either way, it should be pretty obvious how they want it. Just make sure you read underneath where you enter the answer, what form they wish you to have the answer in. Let's move on to the next one. Now, in this case right here, I am going to divide both sides by 16 to get that x squared by itself. And those will cancel out, leaving me x squared is equal to 81 over 16. And I'll take a square root of both sides. Again, the syntax of that square root symbol right there is technically wrong because that's only the positive one, but we want to include the positive and the negative one. So I'm going to put plus and minus the square root of 81 over 16, which gives me x is equal to, right, which is plus or minus the square root of 81 over the 16, square root of 16. Square root of 81 is 9. Square root of 16 is 4. So this simply turns into negative 9/4 and positive 9/4, right? Again, square root of 81 is 9 because 9 times 9 is 81. Square root of 16 is 4 because 4 times 4 is 16. Let's move on to the next one. Now they're saying the area of a square is equal to 225 square millimeters. And we want to find the length, the side length. Now the area formula for a square is area is equal to side squared. So we plug in what we know, which is area is equal to 225 s squared. And we simply take the square root of both sides. And it gives me 15 is equal to s. Now you might be tempted to say, well, what about plus and minus 15, right? Well, that's true, but the length of the side is not going to be negative 15 millimeters. It's going to have to be the positive 15 millimeters. So even though the algebra would kind of tell you there's a plus and a negative, which is true, the context, within the context of this word problem, it doesn't make sense to include the negative one. You're not going to have a negative length of a side. So we're going to use the square root property to solve the equation. So we undo this t squared by taking the square root. We end up with t is equal to plus or minus the square root of 27. Two ways of doing this. One is you take the largest perfect square that you can factor out of 27, which is a 9. That leaves you a 3, right? So 27 divided by 9 is 3. You take the square root of 9, multiply by the square root of 3. Square root of 9 is 3. 3 square roots of 3, right? T is equal to plus or minus 3 square roots of 3. There we go. Now, generally speaking, my math lab is going to want you to write these down separately, the plus and the minus. So you're not going to use that plus minus notation right here. Whenever you enter it, you're going to break it up into the positive and the negative and enter it into my math lab that way. Now, whenever we try to take the square root of both sides of this, something happens. You can't take the square root of a negative. You can have a negative square root, but you can't take the square root of a negative. And that should make sense, right? Because what they're really saying is what squared will give me a negative 81? Well, might be tempted to say 9. Problem with that is 9 squared gives you a positive 81. And even, you might say, well, what about negative 9? Well, negative 9 squared still gives you a positive 81 because a negative times a negative is 81. So the problem with this is there's no real number that makes this true. There's no real number that you can square that will give you a negative 81. So in this case, this is not a real number. Not a real number.